Hello everyone, Zenith20 back again. In this video, we'll be discussing about another fundamental part of Visual Basic programs, which are for loops. Now, what exactly are these loop structures? Well, loop structures allow you to run one or more lines of code repetitively. You can repeat the statements in a loop structure until a condition is true, or until a condition is false, or a specified number of times, or once for each element in a collection. Counter loops or for loops is an example which performs the loop a set number of times. It uses a loop control variable, also called a counter, to keep track of the repetition. You can specify the starting and ending values for this counter, and you can optionally specify the amount by which it increases from one repetition to the next. Let's see how for loops can be implemented in Visual Basic. To create a basic for loop, we start by giving the for keyword, after which we will write the name of our counter variable. The counter variable can have any name. In this case, I'll choose the name counter. Then we will define the range of the counter. I'll give the range from 0 followed with the to keyword and then the second expression. Hence, we will define the counter's range from 0 to 10. Our for loop is completed with the next keyword. Now, any statement which goes into this for loop will be iterated 10 times. We can console.writeLine our counter's variable. So you can see that our counter will be changing the value on each iteration. It will go first from 0 to 10. So if we run the output, you see that we get the output from 0 to 10. So the counter's value is changing throughout the loop. We can give the name of the counter to something else as well. We can name it, for example, I, and it will still function the same. We can optionally also declare our counter as an individual variable and then reference that counter over here. And it will still work the same. We have made the counter as an integer and then we have used in the for loop. The counter can also be defined its type within the loop as well. This statement also creates a perfectly valid for loop. We can also use the step keyword to skip a few iterations in between. By default, the step is 1, which means that it increments by +1 in each iteration. If we increase the step to 2 and run the program, you can see that it is skipping the counter's value and it's incrementing it by +2 every time. So we had first 0, then it added 2, and then it added 2 again, so it's 4. We can even make it 3, and now it will increment the variable by 3 until it reaches 10. What happens if I change the steps value to a negative number? If I do so, then the for loop now will not work because it cannot increment in that manner. But it can do so if our starting range had the first value greater than the second value. Now this for loop will work as it will first of all decrement the 10 and then it will keep on decrementing it until it reaches 0. So if we'll run our program, you can see that it has given us from 10 to 0 backwards. We can do the same thing by increasing the negative value of the step and we'll perform the same pattern where we're getting 10 and then it is decrementing by 2 again until it reaches 0. We are now back with our basic for loop. Another interesting thing which you can do with your for loops is that you can skip an iteration or continue it. In other words, if I, for example, wanted to skip the second iteration, I can do so in this manner. We can place an if statement if counter equals to 2 and we'll pass in the continue statement. After the continue, we give the name of the for loop, and then if we're going to run the program, you can see that it will skip this statement. If we bring this on the top, you can see it has skipped the 2. So it started with 0, 1, and then it went to 3. That's because what the continue statement does is that if the continue statement is given in the for loop, it goes on to the next iteration and it basically leaves the current iteration which it is doing. However, it does not exit the for loop. If we wanted to forcefully exit the for loop for some case without it completing the iteration to its last value, we can use the exit keyword followed with the for word. You can see now it has exited the for loop as it reached the second value. You can even make this 8, for example. Now the for loop will exit at the 8th value. We can also nest for loop. So we can take this for loop and we can nest it within this for loop. But we have to make sure that the name of the counter should be different. We can give the counter any name, and we can also console.write line the counter and the inner counter. Both of them will have the same values. We will also give an empty line in order to see how our loop performs. And you can see it has output 10 times. So basically, it has given us 100 outputs because 10 multiply with it 10 and you get 100. So it first of all outputs 0 to 10 once, and then it outputs 0 to 10 again and again and again. So it basically runs this for loop, which runs 10 times, and this for loop runs runs the inner for loop 10 times. Another thing which you should remember is that for loops have their own scope. So if you are going to access this variable outside of this for loop, you will not be able to do so. If I try to access the inner counter in the outer for loop, I won't be able to do so. But I would be able to access the current counter from the current for loop.